Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our organized webinar session. Thank you for joining early. We are going to wait for a few minutes for the rest of our family to come in and to join us. So please take this time to get yourself comfortable, maybe get something to drink, maybe do like a self-care, well-being check, and we look forward to getting started shortly. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to give some of our other family members about another 5 minutes or so to come on into the room, as we would say. But thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We will begin shortly. If you are joining us, just make sure to please uh, mute your phone as courtesy, not only to the facilitators, but to the rest of your family members. And also take this time to get you some water, to do whatever self-care check you need to do. And we look forward to starting in about another 5 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started and we'll allow any other of our family members that are going to be joining us to come in at their own leisure. Good afternoon and welcome to today's organized webinar. My name is Daniel J. Downer. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm so honored and happy to be co facilitating this webinar this afternoon with my lovely co-facilitator who will introduce herself later on. Organized is a webinar series on organizational capacity building through the Emory University Compass Coordinating Center that were created monthly to share with a broader audience of Southern nonprofit professionals some key information that may be missing. So these webinars are so important because they are designed for busy nonprofit professionals like many of us who are here in the room on the go, just to get a quick training and some resources to help us with our organization function at the highest level. They give us a look at what other things are available at Compass. And specifically, each webinar highlights maybe one or more of 8 core areas of Emory Compass Coordinating Center's capacity building trainings. Also, just know that if you are wanting to request a training, you are definitely able to do that by specifically going to the Compass Initiative website and being able to request a training. Today's webinar is entitled To Be or Not to Be a Nonprofit, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. We will be spending some time in conversation with one another, and my co-facilitator and I will be highlighting a few strategies and tools that you may want to consider for your own organization or your future organization, but also when possibly advocating for policy change within your own local communities. There are about approximately 20,000 new nonprofits started each year in the United States. And currently the IRS reports over 1.5 million registered nonprofits in the country. As the nation continues to work on the ending the HIV epidemic plan, there's certainly the need for us to have more HIV service organizations. And although starting a nonprofit is a great idea, there definitely are many other options that are available to create movement, to provide services, and also to provide support. So today we're going to dive right into it. But before we do that, please, if you are joining us, bear in mind to mute your phone. Also, we have a chat feature. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the session, but you are more than welcome to submit your questions in the chat. And without further ado, I am going to toss the mic, which is a PK reference because I am a PK. I am going to toss the mic to my amazing co-facilitator, Miss Judith.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm very appreciative of that intro. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I'm Judith Venables, CEO of Educated for Success, a for-profit S corporation. I'm an educator, a nonprofit consultant, and relationship author. I've worked 36 of my 46 years of employment within the nonprofit sector, which has been extremely rewarding for me. Today, I'm delighted to share some nonprofit information with you that I sincerely hope will help you with critical decisions that you're making with regards to your nonprofit. First, I want to say a hearty thanks to all of you who have decided to take on the monumental task of starting a nonprofit. It's a noble thing to do and can sometimes be a thankless endeavor. But that's okay, because you've taken this opportunity to serve others with a compassionate spirit and very limited resources. Slide 2, please. First, let's know that nonprofits really do matter for the economics of our counties, states, and nation as a whole. Next slide. Let's look at some impressive numbers so that you can understand, as a potential nonprofit, what you represent for the community as a whole. The National Center for Charitable Statistics states that approximately 1.56 million nonprofits registered with the IRS in 2015. Nonprofits contributed an estimated $985.4 billion to the US economy. An estimated 25.1% of US adults volunteered in 2017, representing $195 billion for in-kind services. And as many of you know who are getting into this business, in-kind service is translated as money when you do your budget. So that's a good thing. Next slide, please. A strong nonprofit sector is key to thriving communities. Nonprofits play a critical role in building communities by providing critical services that contribute to economic stability and mobility. And I know many of you have been paying attention to the pandemic stimulus funds, and you noted that there were monies in there for nonprofits because the governments, the economies understand the importance of nonprofits. So you do have a very, very viable position in all of this. Strong, well-resourced nonprofits that are connected to the decision-making infrastructure in their communities can catalyze growth and opportunity. So you do get a chance to sit at the tables of your city councils and your various entities and help make decisions that affect your communities. Next slide, please. But with all of this good information that we're getting about nonprofits, why do so many of them fail? Next. Well, I've always been told the best way to start anything is on a solid foundation. One major part of your foundation is the nonprofit checklist. Now, as you glance at this list, realize that it is not totally comprehensive. It's just a little bit of what you have to do in the planning phase. You've got to get incorporated, you've got to prepare articles of incorporation, and hopefully you get that right the first time. You've got to recruit board members, apply for IRS 501c3 status, and hope that it doesn't get denied for errors. Create a strategic plan. Well, you get the general idea. I won't read the whole list, but there's a lot to do. Unless you have a dedicated support group and or body of professionals available to assist you at all times, putting the nonprofit together can be grueling, but not impossible. You may even run into some truly frustrating moments in the process, like rejected legal documents, too many items to complete, and not enough hours in the day. Next slide, please. At this point, you may need to go back to the drawing board, which is not a bad idea, because it's better to diligently plan and evaluate before becoming an operable nonprofit with a short shelf life. Next slide, please. It's not uncommon to have thoughts about your timing with regards to the nonprofit during your journey. I can tell you personally that timing is extremely important from many perspectives. Can I give you a quick example? June 2016, I left my full-time employment with a nonprofit to pursue my own nonprofit for English learners. I have extensive experience with ESL learners and desire to take a unique product to multiple underserved communities in our county. I had recruited board members, completed the incorporation process in no time flat. But to my surprise, the 2016 presidential election went a little differently than I anticipated. Suddenly we had a new president whose agenda was to eradicate illegal immigration in this country. My existing participants disappeared rapidly with threats of ISIS visitations. I knew the road ahead would be rough. So in March 2017, I made the difficult decision to dissolve the nonprofit. Much of what I had established was based on the status quo, not the agenda of our newly elected president. I understood the fear of my target participants and had to operate on the side of wisdom. My timing for this project was not good. Next slide, please. But there's no need to worry. It just feels like you're up against the wall. In due time, after getting through the first part of this presentation, you may want to know what your options are. Maybe this isn't the only way to go. Well, you have many choices, but let's talk about a few that are very popular. Next slide, please. First, we're going to look, I'm sorry. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Daniel, and he will tell you more about the fiscal sponsorship.
Thank you so much, Judith, for really setting the foundation for what our discussion is going to be about this afternoon. Before I go any further, I have been trying to be very intentional about making sure that I am exercising the best self-care that I can. So at this moment, I'm going to do what I like to call a hydration check. If you have you had some water today? If you have had water, that's great. If you haven't, please take the time to make sure that you do hydrate yourself. It's really important that we sustain our bodies as well as our mind. With that being said, we are so familiar with, or we may be familiar with, the term 501c3 corporation. Sometimes when we hear that, we think of community-based organizations. We may even think of community health clinics. And while community-based organizations, and particularly 501c3 corporations, are a big part of the movement work that is taking place, they are not the only alternative. They are not the end-all be-all. And so I want to talk in particular about fiscal sponsorship. I am the executive director of the Bros in Combo Initiative, which is a fiscally sponsored organization located in Orlando, Florida, focused around building community among Black, gay, bisexual, queer, and same-gender loving men while protecting and promoting their health equity and their well-being. And so fiscal sponsorship is really an alternative for individuals who may not want to go through all of the steps of becoming a 501c3 corporation. And we're going to get a little bit into that. Next slide. So what is fiscal sponsorship? I can tell you that, fiscal sponsorship is something that's been around since the dawn of time. But what we're seeing now more than ever is fiscal sponsorship becoming a more popular alternative for individuals that are wanting to be able to create impact in a way outside of having to get registered or established as a 501c3. In particular, we're seeing this being something very, very popular with Black and Brown leaders because, just to be quite honest, I don't think we can have a conversation about how establishing a 501c3 in some ways is a privilege that many Black and Brown folks do not have. There's a lot of steps that need to take place into doing that, and sometimes individuals do not have the power or the access or the privilege in order to do that. And so fiscal sponsorship allows individuals to be able to create impact without maybe necessarily having to go through the steps of establishing a 501c3. Fiscal sponsorship is a written agreement between a nonprofit organization that already is established as a 501c3 tax-exempt status, so that's the actual fiscal sponsor, and an individual, an initiative, a movement, or a project that does not have a 501c3. The agreement, it allows the fiscal sponsor to accept the funds on behalf specifically of that individual or the initiative, the movement, or the project. And then in return, the individual accepts the responsibility to ensure that whatever the funds are designed to be used for, that they're properly spent to achieve the proposed goals. Next slide. So there's some elements to fiscal sponsorship. And I love this graphic because it kind of has different utensils, and I feel like those are kind of some of the different tools that are needed. One, resources are given to the 501c3, excuse me, tongue-tied, tax-exempt organization, the fiscal sponsor, and that organization acts as the guardian of the resources, specifically for the individual or the entity that does not have the 501c3 status. The fiscal sponsor must use the resources received for a specific purpose. Also, the fiscal sponsor sometimes retains discretion as to the distribution of the resources. So when we're referring to that, depending on how the agreement, which we'll get into a little bit later on, depending on how the agreement is made, the fiscal sponsor has the autonomy to decide whether that may be a setup where it's direct deposit, or maybe the fiscal sponsor may require that there's an invoice submitted and then a check that's dispersed. And then lastly, the fiscal sponsor maintains records that substantiate the use of resources for appropriate 501c3 purposes. Next slide. So there are two main types of fiscal sponsorships. There's one which is called pre-approved grant, where the fiscal sponsor does not own the project. And then there's another type of fiscal sponsorship, which is called comprehensive, where the fiscal sponsor owns the project. The best way to simplify this, in my past life, I felt that I wanted to be a songwriter and vocal arranger. So to give you, in the best possible way that I can, some similarities, think of a fiscal sponsorship as almost like an artist, a music artist. For a pre-approved grant fiscal sponsorship, that's more of like an independent artist that has a distribution deal with a major label. So that artist can decide what songs they want to write, what songwriters they may want to utilize, what producers, how they want the sound of it to be. And the major label is just more so helping with like the distribution, the amplifying of it. Whereas with comprehensive, it might be more of like an artist that has like a 360 deal. So they're on a major label and the label is controlling everything, from the content that they're developing, to the way the content is distributed, to the songwriters that they're working with, to the producers that they're working with. Hopefully that has simplified a little bit better your understanding of how these two fiscal sponsorships work. In particular, with my organization, the Bros in Convo Initiative, our fiscal sponsorship is pre-approved. So our fiscal sponsor does not own creative control of our programming or the content that we are sharing. Our fiscal sponsor is just acting as the holding storehouse for funds that are being sent on our behalf. Next slide. Okay. So let's get into some advantages and disadvantages. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we will make sure that we can try to answer them during our Q&A session. There definitely are some advantages as well as some disadvantages to fiscal sponsorship. So the advantages to fiscal sponsorship is it allows the ability for an individual, an entity, an initiative, a movement to be able to receive tax-deductible donations. Also, honestly, it allows you to be able to get off of the ground a lot faster. My organization, the Bros in Convo Initiative, was started from just a mini grant And I needed to find a way. They required that either you be a 501c3 or you have a fiscal sponsor. And so the quickest way for me to ensure that I was able to receive those funds was to find a fiscal sponsor. And so it allows individuals, entities, and organizations the ability to get off the ground a lot faster. It also provides you a wider base of support because you're now being able to tap into the communities that that particular fiscal sponsor is serving or providing services to. Also technical support and administrative support. So when we're thinking about like organizations, there's so many other things that come with that, whether that is liability, insurance, rental space, communication, computers, internet, all of those different things. So an advantage to having a fiscal sponsor is that you might be able to have those services accessible and readily available to you versus having to pay specifically for each of those. And then lastly, potentially lower insurance costs. Generally with fiscal sponsorship, the fiscal sponsor's liability and insurance is going to be covering that individual, that entity, or that initiative. And so that's definitely an advantage. But there are some disadvantages. So, one is the surrender of control to the fiscal sponsor, which I talked about before. If you're having more of a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship arrangement, you may not necessarily have all of the control that you might want to have. And even if you do have a pre-approved, there may be some things that you might not be able to control. In particular, when I had discussed about how possibly funds may be dispersed, that might be something that you might have to surrender control to the fiscal sponsor. Another disadvantage is an administrative fee. So it's very common for fiscal sponsors to charge an administrative fee based on the amount of funds that that individual or that entity is bringing in. And so that might possibly be a disadvantage. On the flip side, if you are a 501c3 organization, an advantage to having a fiscally sponsored initiative or entity is it may be able to help amplify your mission and your values of your organization. It'll also help widen your base of support because that entity or that organization may be able to tap into a community or communities that your organization's not necessarily being able to reach. But there are also some disadvantages. Once again, liability. That individual and that entity is under your insurance and your liability. And so that might be possibly a disadvantage if a situation like that arises. Next slide, please. So, how do you go about establishing a fiscal sponsorship? The first thing that I want to note is that fiscal sponsorship can go one of two ways. It could be a beautiful, blissful marriage, or it could be a horrible disaster. So, it's really important to, in the beginning, really establish a foundation to what that marriage is going to be. So, how do you find a fiscal sponsor? Um, I recommend looking at local 501c3 organizations that align with your mission and your vision. There is a tool that I have listed here, fiscalsponsordirectory.org, that was created by the San Francisco Study Center. It does have a list of um, possible organizations that are available to serve as fiscal sponsors, and it does it based on various causes. The second thing is once you've identified your fiscal sponsor, I recommend submitting a proposal to the fiscal sponsor. This is basically like a written sponsorship saying like you're wanting to have a fiscal sponsorship, but these are the reasons why. So describing each specific activity that you're wanting to conduct, and then how will the sponsorship be able to further, what's in it for the fiscal sponsor, and how it will align with their specific mission and their vision. Next slide, please. Then, after you've done that, you want to make sure, and this is a very important part, that you execute a fiscal sponsorship agreement in writing. I cannot stress it enough that if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist and it didn't occur. So, making sure that you execute a fiscal sponsorship agreement in writing that gives a very detailed outline of what are the terms and the conditions of the sponsorship, what are the rights and responsibilities, the specific work that's going to be performed, and then in the event that you decide that this is not a marriage that you want to be in, how will resources be separated from the fiscal sponsor in case of termination? This is the best time to really put everything that you want in there, not only to make sure that it's something that the fiscal sponsor is okay with, but really also to be able to protect yourself, to make sure that the things that you're wanting to do in order to create impact and movement, you're able to do that without any challenges. And then once both you and your fiscal sponsor have agreed to the fiscal sponsorship agreement and signed it, you're just wanting to make sure that you're operating in accordance with the terms of the fiscal sponsorship agreement. One of the things that I personally do with my fiscal sponsors that we meet on a monthly basis, to go over expenditure reports, to go over programming, as well as various new ideas in marketing. So the relationship just doesn't end when you both have signed the agreement. It's something that's continuous throughout, and you definitely want to cultivate that relationship that you have with your fiscal sponsor. I also will say that some individuals have asked, if you are fiscally sponsored, do you need to have a board? Do you not need to have a board? I would encourage you to have a board just because I believe in using myself as an example. I statements. Yes, I'm the executive director of my organization, but sometimes my idea might not be the best idea. And so it's really great to have a governing body, my board of directors, as well as my community advisory group that are really kind of making sure that the mission and the vision and the values of the organization are really what are being seen and felt throughout every idea, every program, everything that's cultivated. If you do not want to have a board, that's completely fine. I would encourage, if you're going to go the option of not having a board, that at the very least you have a community advisory group of individuals that make up the communities that you're providing services to be able to provide some type of governance. Next slide. So these are some frequently asked questions, and I wanted to be able to provide them for everyone. Some of this I've already talked about. There are some other services that you could use beyond just the tax exempt status. So you might be able to access your fiscal sponsors accounting, their grants management, HR, payroll and benefits administration, professional development and consultations, as well as opportunities for outreach. What fee would you be charged and when is it taken? Is it refunded? So this is really more so or should be spelled out specifically in the fiscal sponsorship agreement. Fees typically they range from like nothing at all to 25%, but on average, the average fee is it's around 10%. So sometimes fiscal sponsors may take it specifically from the revenue, the funds as they are received, or others will take the fee from the expenses as they're incurred. Should you get regular, timely, accurate financial accounting? Yes. Yes, yes. If your fiscal sponsor is not providing you your monthly expenditure reports, um, you don't have a reliable fiscal sponsor. And you might want to reevaluate that or have a conversation with them. Once again, the fiscal sponsorship is a marriage, but it's important that the individual, the entity, the initiative, or the organization definitely know exactly not only the level of impact they're creating, but specifically financially where they are, as well as where they're wanting to go. Does the fiscal sponsor provide programmatic and financial oversight? So this really depends on, once again, whether it's a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship or it's a pre-approved. Typically, if it's pre-approved, your fiscal sponsor will not be involved in your creative decisions, but will just make sure and verify like whatever you're proposing that the funds are being used for is carried out. And does your fiscal sponsor file grant reports with your grantors? It depends. Specifically, with our organization, we provide the grant reports to our grantors. Our fiscal sponsor just looks over it to make sure that like the numbers are in alignment with one another. But once again, sometimes you can have fiscal sponsors who assume the responsibility for tracking and submitting and maintaining copies of the reports. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about fiscal sponsorship, but that's not the only alternative that individuals have to being a 501c3. There are some other alternatives, and I'm going to toss the mic back to my co-facilitator, Judith, to talk about some of those.
All right, thank you, Daniel, and I really did enjoy that presentation. I also worked under a fiscal sponsorship, and it is a very positive thing to consider if you're not ready to do the whole shebang with the 501c3. It's a beautiful way to explore where you're going without actually having all the liability that goes with the 501c3. So just something to think about. But while you're digesting that and trying to consider if that's one of your options, I have a few more that I want you to consider. Excuse me, next slide, please. You may want to think about an unincorporated nonprofit association. So what is that exactly? Sometimes it's called a UNA. It's a quick fix for an immediate need. So say you have a need that you see that you want to address in the community, but you really just don't want to do a full-blown nonprofit. Well, this nonprofit version is similar. It's a version of limited liability. It is defined as two or more people who join together by mutual consent to pursue a common nonprofit purpose. No authority or management organization is required because it is a nonprofit organization. One of the negatives for forming a UNA is that organizing members carry the same liability as the association. So it's important that you get incorporated as soon as possible. So you may say, what's an example? Well, let's just say you live in a community without an HOA and they're threatening to tear down the neighborhood park and you want your kids to have the park. So you and some of the parents can come together with funds and decide to keep the park open. So what you've done, in fact, is become a very quick fix to a problem, and you're an unincorporated nonprofit association. It happens more often than you would think. And it's fine as long as you don't forget at some point when you start raising a certain amount of money, you need to go ahead and pursue the nonprofit status. Next slide, please. Another thing you might want to think about is becoming a local chapter of a national nonprofit. Large nonprofits extend their reach from state to state, utilizing affiliates or chapters to run their services. Good examples of these are Boys and Girls Club, Girl Scouts of America, the American Cancer Society, and the American Red Cross. So there are establishments in all states, and you can become a local chapter if that's something that's near and dear to your heart. And then you don't have to have as much output, you will have a buy-in and lots of support from the national chapter. Another entity is a social entrepreneurship. So what is that exactly? This type of business is established to develop, fund, and implement solutions to social, cultural, and environmental issues. These are very effective organizations. People are often attracted to businesses that use social entrepreneurship models because they're helping to solve a social problem when they spend money on something they need or want. So can you think of something in recent days that you've seen on TV where people are like, oh, that would be awesome if they could do that? They're talking about the straws. They're talking about water bottles, how they contaminate the oceans and disrupt the waters. This kind of thing is very, very important to many people because they want to see a world for their children when they grow up. So they give to this very readily. Just something to think about if you have a really, really social type of issue that you want to put out there. Next slide, please. There's some honorable mentions here. A lot of people don't think about when they have a real passion for something that they could volunteer for that particular cause. A lot of nonprofits would welcome you with open arms. Trust me, there's never enough human resources to get the job done. So if you ever feel like, yes, I want to give back to literacy, I want to give back to some cause or the other, think about volunteering. And it also helps the organization in that they can use your in-kind services toward their budget. Your human resource servicing also translates to dollars for them. So you're giving in more ways than one. You're solving an issue inside of your heart to give back, and you're also helping that organization count you as money in the bank. Next slide, please. And I think we're coming to the end of our presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Daniel so that he can take us into our survey.
Sure. If you could go back to the slide that talked about the honorable mentions. Thank you so much, Ms. Jude. Thank you so much. I wanted to definitely highlight some other ones, in particular, donor advised fund, giving circle, and fundraising for a specific cause. These are definitely other ways to, or other alternatives to having a 501c3 in which individuals can create impact. In particular, I can talk about the fundraising for a specific cause. Everyone is very well familiar with the emerging COVID-19 pandemic. And so here in Central Florida, the Rosenkampf Initiative and some of our other sibling organizations realized that the epidemic COVID-19 pandemic is affecting and impacting marginalized communities a lot more than others. In particular, when we think of transgender individuals, Black and brown folks, LGBTQ plus folks, individuals that are undocumented. And so one way we were able to do that was by creating a community giving fund called the LGBTQ, Central Florida LGBTQ plus Relief Fund, so that we were able to provide direct assistance to those most in need. So there are so many different ways to where you can create impact, you can support community, you can help community outside of just having a 501c3. This is not to negate from the great work that 501c3 organizations and corporations are doing, but I think one of the beautiful things about racial and social justice, the history of racial and social justice movements, is that we've seen that they were created by individuals and then they became collectives and organizations, and there's such a different variety of different players in the racial and social justice movement. And so I do want us to bear that in mind. Can we go forward to our Q&A slide, please? We are being asked, will you be able to, I'm so sorry, someone has asked, will you be able to be emailed the PowerPoint presentation? The presentation is being recorded, and we definitely can coordinate with Emory Compass Coordinating Center to see and make sure that we can get the presentation available to you if we're allowed to do that. What other questions do you have for myself or Miss Judith? Someone is asking about what are some of the challenges that I experienced in getting my initiative started, and how did I navigate that? Thank you so much for your question. I think one of the biggest challenges that I experienced was really being able to fully explain to individuals what fiscal sponsorship is, as well as being able to find a fiscal sponsor. So when I was trying to start my initiative, uh, there was definitely some challenge in individuals specifically understanding what fiscal sponsorship was. And it was very challenging with me finding a fiscal sponsor that I felt aligned with my mission, my vision, and the values that I had. Um, the best way that I was able to navigate that was really by one, doing my research about each of the prospective organizations that I had an interest in being my fiscal sponsor. But then I also schedule time to specifically meet with the executive director of those organizations, as well as I did what I call a test run. So I had I presented opportunities to each of the organizations for collaboration, and based on the interactions that we had with that really allowed me to finally determine like specifically which fiscal sponsor I wanted, which organization I wanted to be my fiscal sponsor. Um, I'm sorry, I hope that answers your question. There's a question that I'm going to direct to you, Miss Judith. Are there ways that LLCs can function as nonprofit organizations?
Now, that is a question I would have to research. Nonprofit organizations as a whole, I'm not sure if they're designated as the same as for-profit, as corporation, LLCs. I would have to really investigate that. I've not been asked that question, but I'd like to look at that momentarily, if you could let me get back to it.
Yeah, and if I can chime in a little bit about it, like
Okay.
nonprofit being an LLC, yes, but it's not as as straightforward. So like if a company can claim ownership by like a single tax exempt nonprofit organization, it may be able to qualify as an LLC as long as the other requirements that have been set by the IRS have been met. So like those specific requirements, they're found in the IRS mandate. And I believe it's referred to as like the limited liability companies as exempt organization update. So yes, a nonprofit can be an LLC, but one, it has to it can qualify as long as the other requirements are being met and it's ownership by a single tax exempt nonprofit organization. I hope that answers your question or at least provides a little bit of clarity. What other questions do you have for Ms. Judith and myself?
Gary, are these questions that were sent privately, are they allowed to be discussed? Scary and Dare?
Yes, ma'am. I just sent a message. Yes, that was somebody had asked about some giving circles, and just maybe talk a little bit more about what is a giving circle? How can one be become?
I do apologize on the page of honorable mentions. That was cut off. I couldn't see the bottom. So I do apologize to our audience for not addressing those other issues. But a giving circle is where you as a donor and a group of friends, you get together and you pool your monies. And you decide where you want to give those monies to different charities or community projects. And this kind of creates an awareness of you as a group of people who like to give to various causes. Is a beautiful thing to do. We've had several to give to us a couple of times. They try to go around and serve other organizations, but you can become the initiator of such a group, whereby if you have money that you feel like, yes, I want to do more to help urban kids do this or some other group do that, that's a beautiful thing to do, but it starts with your funding toward those projects.
And I would just add to all the amazing stuff that you've said, Ms. Judith, that there are some giving circles that are supported by community foundations. So those do offer like a variety of services to donors who wish to set up charitable funds without maybe having to incur administrative and legal costs. If you're interested in maybe wanting to see which specific community foundations do that, the Council on Foundations Community Foundation Locator can help you with that. So if you Google the Council on Foundations Community Foundation Locator, it'll definitely help you do that. And then there are some giving circles who also utilize like a fiscal sponsorship arrangement just to make sure the maximum efficiency in their financial activities. So we currently have 3 more minutes. Do we have any other questions? If not, can we go to the next slide, please? So before we go, please, if you can, complete the survey. It's also in the chat. We would love to hear some of, I like to say, the glows and grows of the webinar. So some things that resonated with you and some things that you may have wanted more time for us to spend. 1 hour is definitely not enough time. We could go on and on and on, but we're so thankful that each and every one of you were able to join us on the Emory Compass Coordinating Center Compass Initiatives organized webinar for today. Thank you so much to the Emory Compass Coordinating Center for having myself and Ms. Judith be a part of this. Once again, please feel free to complete the survey and have an amazing afternoon. Love on yourself, hug on yourself, and send virtual love and hug to someone else. Ms. Judith, did you have anything that you wanted to add in closing?
I just want to say thanks to each of you all for joining in today. It's always a pleasure to share the beauty of the nonprofit experience with others. And I hope that you are headed in a direction that feels good, or at least glean something today that maybe helps you to think differently, or just, get a whole idea of where you want to go from here. But I do appreciate your time. If you do have questions, hopefully our information will be available to you. If nothing else, a review of the PowerPoint. And each of you be blessed and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day and week.